Hi again, everyone. Alexander here for another installment of 30 Days of Symphony. Well, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner. We certainly have had quite a gloriously heavy banquet of heavy German music, courtesy of the letter B. It's just fun to do this all alphabetically. It's the best way to stay organized, actually, as we traverse the heights of the symphonic repertoire. But now, courtesy of the letters C and D and E and F, I get to don some French blue here because I get to now go far afield to another part of Europe and share with you the delights of La Symphonie Française. Specifically today, this tragically obscure, and it has not always been obscure, but these days, sadly obscure and noble and beautifully sad symphony, the Symphony in B flat major of Ernest Chaussen. Now you may be asking, who is Ernest Chaussen? Well, some of you probably already know, because if you love music for violin and orchestra, one of the most celebrated works from the late Romantic era is actually a work that we performed a couple of years ago with that wonderful young American violinist Tessa Lark, the poem or poem for violin and orchestra by Ernest Chaussen. And like most of the music he left the world in his all too short existence, it has this very noble, elegant sadness to it. Excuse me, Chaussen is not the kind of composer whose music you'd want to listen to every day, but as we were discussing yesterday, I would say the same about the symphonies of Anton Bruckner. More importantly, Chaussen represents a time and place in our Western civilization that is among the most glorious of all time. And I'm referring to the years in Paris, France, during what is commonly referred to as La Belle Époque, this glorious age, the beautiful era, the beautiful age, which basically, broadly speaking, went from France's recovery from its disastrous Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 up until the First World War, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. France had gone into a state of absolute catastrophe when Napoleon III, remember we were talking about him a few pieces back, Napoleon III, who was Napoleon's nephew, who was elected as president of French Republic, and soon, much like his uncle, unilaterally declared himself emperor of France in, I think it was 1850 or 51. And unlike Napoleon, he got away with it for about good 20 years. Napoleon III was actually a very effective, benevolent dictator of France. If you go to Paris and you take in the delights of what is easily the most beautiful city on earth, that is all Napoleon III's doing, because he, through his loyal lieutenant, one of the genius urban planners of all time, the Baron Haussmann, Georges Haussmann, who was a Frenchman of largely German descent, he was Napoleon III's kind of contractor, super contractor. He planned and actually ended up leveling much of Paris, old Paris, to the ground, and rebuilt Paris into the gorgeous and then quite modern city that we all know and love, whether we've been there in person or have seen it in the movies or paintings, what have you. Napoleon III was responsible for that, and Baron Haussmann's main kind of lieutenant, as it were, one of his principal contractors, was the father of Ernest Chaussen. So Chaussen grew up in the mid to late 19th century with, as we say, a private income. He did not have to compose to make a living. And he, in the 1870s and 1880s, became one of the devoted band of followers of the great Belgian organist and composer who moved to Paris and became a Frenchman to the core. I'm referring to Cesar Franck. Now, we were talking about Bruckner just the other day. Bruckner, who was, again, this church organist from the provinces who'd gone to the big city, in his case, Vienna, and was seen as a bit of a kind of a simpleton, but he had these friends in high places who burnished his image and supported him emotionally and sometimes financially. Franck in Paris had a very similar situation. He was a boy from Liège, that city in Belgium, and moved to Paris at the earliest opportunity, I think it was very early 20s, because of course, in the mid-19th century, Paris was the place where everyone wanted to be. Bruckner, of course, was organist for the Imperial Chapel in Vienna. Franck had a similarly august position. Eventually, he worked his way up to it over many decades. He was the organist at the great French Basilica of Sainte Clotilde, which still stands to this day, and was widely admired for his skills as an organist, not really as a composer. A lot of people just refused to take his music seriously. But over the years, he developed this passionate band of followers who were known as La Bande à Franck, or kind of Franck's kind of gang. And curiously, they were almost all from well-to-do backgrounds. They were people who did not have to compose for a living, which provided a strange kind of contrast to Franck himself, who basically worked from dawn to midnight every day of his life as a church organist and composer and teacher, most of all, at the Paris Conservatory, where, interestingly, he attracted this band of pupils, but not through composition lessons, because the Paris Conservatory, which by the 1870s was a completely hidebound institution, by the later 19th century, Germany is where you go to study mainly how to compose music. But the Paris Conservatory faculty was so hidebound that they allowed Franck to give an organ class, but he could not teach composition. So he ended up turning his organ classes into composition classes, kind of surreptitiously. So Ernest Chaussen, son of one of, again, the Baron Haussmann's principal subcontractors, was one of these young men and women. There are actually a couple of women pupils of Franck also at that time. And Chaussen left very little music because he just didn't have to write music for a living. He also had a tragically short life. In early middle age, I don't even think he was even 40. He was bicycling on his country estate. Now, you have to remember, in the 1890s, bicycling was all the rage, and you've probably seen drawings and posters of people riding those gigantic contraptions with like a gigantic front wheel and a tiny back wheel. Well, Chaussen was one of these people. He was one of these wild enthusiasts of the newly invented bicycle. And he was riding his bicycle on his estate one fine summer day, and he was riding down a hill, and he lost control of his bicycle and slammed into a stone wall and died instantly. It was a tragedy for his family, but also for French music, because not only was he an exceptionally fine composer, again, of a certain kind of very erudite music, but he was also, because he was well-to-do, he was also a champion of composers who were equally, if not more gifted, but much less financially fortunate. Chaussen will be always remembered as a patron of the young Claude Debussy. We'll get to Debussy a little later. Excuse me. As I was saying, Chaussen, who did not even get really to middle age, left us very few works. He tended to write one work in each of the principal genres. So there's an unfinished string quartet, there's a piano trio, there's a also unfinished piano quartet, and then there is that beautiful poem for violin and orchestra, which is his one piece of music that has permanently been in the repertoire. And then there's a beautiful song cycle for middle voice, like a contralto and orchestra. And then there is this, for me, the crowning glory, well, many conductors over the decades have considered it his crowning glory, the Symphony in B flat. Now, this was a symphony that was written in 3 movements, not the usual 4. It was inspired by the model of also the only symphony written by his mentor, his idol, their pater seraphicus, as they called him, their serene father, Cesar Franck. We'll get to Franck in a little while, and as you remember, the Cesar Franck Symphony in D minor is also in just 3 movements. There's officially no scherzo. It's fast, slow, fast, and Chaussen did the same thing. Some critics actually have found the Chaussen Symphony to be an even greater work than the symphony of his master, Cesar Franck. I would disagree. I think they're equally great. Chaussen's symphony is more elegant, more urbane, if you will. And again, that's because of his more privileged background, the fact that he could be a kind of dilettante in the best sense of the word. He just wrote really for the pleasure, for the emotional fulfillment, the creative fulfillment of being a composer. So he had more time to kind of pick and choose from the musical, palette, if you will, of all the music that was going around him. The principal influence for Chaussen is, as much as his mentor, Cesar Franck, it is the music of Richard Wagner. Now, you remember we were talking about the music of Anton Bruckner previously in our alphabetic survey, how it's especially in Bruckner's slow movements that the music of Wagner feels most apparent, but otherwise the prevailing influences are of Beethoven and, more than anyone else, Franz Schubert. With Chaussen, the influence of Wagner is everywhere, from the very first measure to the very last. Wagner kind of hangs over the music like a pall, and I mean that not necessarily in a negative way. It's just that all of Cesar Franck's pupils, his devoted band of followers, they had all made the pilgrimage after the total catastrophe of the Franco-Prussian War that Napoleon III brought on to France single-handedly. It was his great undoing, and he made the ultimate mistake that a European emperor in that time could make, and that he went to war with another country with no allies. So he foolishly kind of goaded Prussia into war. It was a complete and total disaster. You may know that something called the Paris Commune also happened in 1871, which was another total catastrophe for different but related reasons. Anyway, out of this cultural and political catastrophe, these well-to-do young Frenchmen go to Bayreuth, which Bayreuth, of course, is the opera festival, the opera shrine that Richard Wagner had established with the patronage of King Ludwig of Bavaria, crazy King Ludwig, to this day, it is this shrine to his music dramas. Only Wagner's operas can be performed on stage at Bayreuth. I think there's one exception, Mozart's Don Giovanni, but nothing else can be. Only Wagner. And every year the Bayreuth Festival occurs, and you really are like a pilgrim going to a shrine. Well, all these well-to-do young Frenchmen made the pilgrimage to Bayreuth and were absolutely transfixed, and Chaussen was one of these people. So the sense of that sense of sublime tragedy that you get in Wagner's music, especially scores like Parsifal and Tristan and Isolde, you feel this everywhere. But, and this is extremely important, it is Wagner through a very French, very urbane, French, Francophile lens. The edges have all been smoothed over. There is, again, this kind of very urbane quality to the music that some people find a bit removed, a bit emotionally removed. I find it absolutely gorgeous. This is a work that takes some doing to get to know. It, for a while in the 1950s, it got performed a lot because for obvious reasons in the 1950s in the post-war era, German conductors were not exactly, the flavor of the month for obvious reasons. And Russian conductors, or conductors in Eastern Europe, were literally not available because of something called the Iron Curtain. So we often say jokingly that in the 1950s, if you wanted to be a major conductor in America, you either had to be French or Hungarian, because there were all these Hungarian refugees, like 1956 and all of that, the failed Hungarian Revolution. And it was like, for a brief shining moment, all the major music directors of all the big American orchestras were either Hungarian or French. So in the 50s, we had all these great French conductors as maestros of our greatest orchestras. There was, at the Boston Symphony Orchestra, there was one of my heroes, Charles Munch. And then in San Francisco, there was Pierre Monteux. And then even in Detroit, there was the great Paul Paré, who did so much to build the Detroit Symphony into one of the great American orchestras. And lest we forget, at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, there was the great French conductor Jean-Marc Dinon, who was there in the 1960s. So for like 20 years, there were all these French conductors who had these powerful positions running American orchestras. So the French repertoire got done suddenly a lot, and not just like Debussy or Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, but these slightly off the beaten track works by composers like Cesar Franck and Ernest Chausson, one of his great pupils. So for about 20 years, this piece actually got done quite a lot, and there's some very classic recordings that still can be listened to this day. And then the whole French conductor thing kind of faded, and then this repertoire faded along with it. So now this music is almost never heard, and it's a shame, because again, just think of the Symphony in B flat of Ernest Chausson as a beautiful French meal in 3 elegant but very substantial courses, each one accompanied by exactly the right French wine. It's in a broad 3-movement plan. It lasts about 33 minutes, so it is fairly compact as symphonies go. And again, it's a moderately fast movement, and then this very slow, this slow movement with this noble tragedy, and then a tempestuous finale, where Chausson was also very much influenced by the romantic painters of the earlier generation, people like Delacroix and Géricault, these great revolutionary romantic painters. The music is all kind of fire and brimstone, and then the very sad music of the slow introduction to the first movement, in other words, the music of the very beginning, comes back at the very end. And so the music begins and ends with what is one of the great trumpet solos in the repertoire. It's a wonderful work for the trumpet, where the trumpet player gets to display their ability not to play loudly, but very eloquently and with a great sense of lyricism, a great sense of line. So in a very quiet, lyrical way, the work begins and ends with one of the great trumpet solos in the repertory. So if this is a new discovery for you, I hope that it'll be one that you will savor, like that beautiful 3-course French meal at one of Lacrosse's fine French restaurants. So here, with the noted French conductor of the mid-century, Jean Fournet, conducting the NHK Symphony, the great radio orchestra of Japan. Jean Fournet conducting this symphony in B-flat major, this sad, noble, elegant work of Ernest Chausson.